and unsustainable logging, drawing on experiences of more than 10 years of implementing the FLEGT Action Plan and certification, as well as highlighting how these efforts contribute to halting deforestation and mitigating climate change. Third, increase awareness of processes, systems, and tools that countries have developed to improve legal compliance and sustainability along wood supply chains, including the strengthening and simplification of legal frameworks and standards, as well as the development of verification or certification systems with complementary traceability and monitoring systems. And finally, fourth, to demonstrate the importance of multi-stakeholder participation to ensure nationally owned forest governance reform and the development of robust verification and certification systems for wood and commodities that are both inclusive and easy to implement. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker and panelists, and then start the session. So our keynote speaker will be Mr. Chin-Cho Norbu, the former executive director of Asian Forestry Cooperation Organization. Our panelists are Mr. Chris Biko, director of the Timber Validation Department of the Ghana Forestry Commission, who will be joining us virtually. We also have Mr. Jose Filadelfo Martinez, civil society representative and facilitator of the VPA process in Honduras, and Mr. Peter Fielberg, executive director of Preferred by Nature. And our final panelist is Mr. Eric Luia, vice chairman for Overseas Marketing, Indonesia Furniture Industry, and Handicraft Association, as Asimindo. So after our first session of the panelists, we'll have a short presentation by me, Melissa Blue Sky, from the Center for International Environmental Law. And then we'll have another session of the panel before the closing remarks by Ms. Shyam Sadhguru, the Executive Director of ITTO. And finally, this session is organized by FAO's Forest Law Enforcement, Governance, and Trade Program. And on behalf of the panel, I'd like to express our appreciation for to them for convening this session, and to FAO and the Korea Forest Service for the broader Congress. So without further ado, Mr. Chin-Cho Norbu.
Thank you, Melissa. Good morning. At the outset, I would like to thank FAO and Korea Forest Service team for inviting me to speak at the 15th World Forestry Congress, Session 4 of Sub-Theme 1, Strengthening Governance and Verification Systems to Halt and Reverse Deforestation and Forest Degradation. I would also like to thank my AFOCO colleagues from Indonesia, Myanmar, Thailand, and the FAO FLEGT program team for their contribution to this statement. Let me begin my statement by sharing some observations from my field trips and also some key policy decisions related to improving forest governance in order to better manage, conserve, and protect forest resources in my country, Bhutan, and beyond. In 2010, I led a team of experts to study diversity of soil, biodiversity along the snowmelt tract of Bhutan with altitude reaching as high as 5,100 meters above sea level. I was alarmed to see how glaciers have retreated over the years, leading to formation of numerous dangerous glacial lakes that are likely to pose a threat to downstream settlements. The snow-capped peaks, rocks, and meadows dominated the local environment with no human settlement around. In 2020, an AFOCO team visited Mount Halal, the highest peak in South Korea, where we observed that the popular Korean fir were affected by severe dieback disease and a number of volcanic craters with no water or ice. There are similar examples of these clear indicators of global warming all over the world. And these indicators, supported by scientific findings in many IPCC reports, are being witnessed with increasing frequency. One question that keeps coming to my mind time and time again is, what can we do to halt deforestation and forest degradation to help combat the local and the global effects of climate change? There exist many international initiatives and targets, including SDG 13, climate action, SDG 15, life on land, the Paris Agreement, the Bond Challenge, the UN Strategic Plan for Forests, and UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. But how can countries turn commitments into effective emission reduction and sustainable forest management? One of the options to fight climate change that I believe our community can collectively take up is to restore degraded forest landscapes through assisted natural regeneration and planting of suitable tree species. Many of us in this room are aware that technology to restore degraded forest landscape and revive ecosystem services is not the biggest challenge and is only one side of the coin. A major challenge is to avoid or prevent forest degradation and deforestation in first place, and find ways to manage existing forests in a more sustainable way. Recognizing that access and authority to manage forest resources are heavily influenced by each country's own socio-economic and cultural realities. Solutions to promote sustainable forest management and halt forest degradation and deforestation must be found locally. Sustainable forest management practices and effective law enforcement must be based on continuous improvement of national, legal, and institutional frameworks. These frameworks must ensure that the roles and responsibilities of all stakeholders in the forest sector are clear and unambiguous, and that the forest management and forest and enforcement actions undertaken by all these actors contribute to legality and sustainability of the sector. The development and implementation of robust verification system, which comprise of requirements and corresponding verification actions, is needed to guide forest management activities and forest sector businesses towards compliance and to strengthen law enforcement. These systems also produce verifiable data and information on the performance of the sector to ensure timely correction where needs be. My point here is that legal and sustainable use of forest resources and corresponding verification systems go hand in hand, and the both are needed to achieve and demonstrate good forest governance. Genuine participation and engagement of private sector and civil society are also needed to ensure that verification systems and the legal and institutional frameworks that define them do not put an unnecessary burden on timber producers and processing businesses, as well as the administration implementing or supporting these systems. Unnecessary bottlenecks should be removed to allow these systems to fully contribute to sustainability and societal needs and help resolve the climate crisis. I would like to start by using Bhutan as an example of a country that has revised its legal and institutional framework in its effort to decrease deforestation. Bhutan has over 71% forest cover, and more than 50% of the total geographical area of the country is under protected areas. Early on, shifting cultivation was identified as one of the main causes of deforestation in the country. And in 1993, with the submission of people's representatives, the 72nd National Assembly session banned this farming method among the rural communities. In 1999, the export of timber, either in the form of blocks, sawn timber, or firewood, was banned with the introduction of timber marketing and pricing policy. More recently, in 2008, Bhutan enacted a new constitution in which Article 5 is specifically dedicated to the conservation of rich natural resources, mandating a minimum of 60% of total land area under forest for all time to come. I can humbly say that all the above was possible thanks to the exemplary leaderships in the environment sector by our monarchs and the elected politicians. Yet, the deforestation and forest degradations, including small-scale local illegal timber harvest and people coming across the porous border to harvest illegal, continues. This shows that improving institutional and legal framework is not sufficient by itself, and that the strong law enforcement and effective verification systems are needed to ensure that laws are properly enforced and complied with. A good example is the implementation of CITES permitting system, which is based on compliance with the national conservation law and principle. Bhutan was once used as a transit route for red sandalwood harvested illegally, but our forest department strengthened the control mechanisms and managed to crack down on illegal red sandalwood trade. Success was achieved by engaging with local communities and by providing the necessary training on CITES-related requirements and law enforcement practices to relevant government agencies which are previously not aware of these requirements and practices. I assume such cases of ignorance of legal framework coupled with weak governance are common in all our countries where a large section of the population is dependent on forest resources for employment, income, food, timber, fuel wood, and many other things. I would like to provide 3 more examples, 2 from the region and 1 from Central America, to show how improving forest governance and the developing a robust verification system through genuine engagement of all stakeholders can have a positive impact on management of natural resources. These examples are based on evidence that timber legality assurance systems developed in the framework of FLEGT voluntary partnership agreements are at the origin of some of the most sophisticated and comprehensive regulatory systems developed, contributing to the improved forest management and reducing deforestation and forest degradation. There is a lot of experience to be learned from these efforts, even for countries that are not involved in such initiatives. The implementation of Indonesia Timber Legality Assurance System, called SVLK, began in 2009. It is a mandatory system where all enterprises utilizing forest timber products at all stages of production, from upstream to downstream, must comply with its relevant requirements. SVLK became fully operational in 2016. In 2021, C4 and FO impact assessment of SVLK reported that since 2016, Indonesia's deforestation rate dropped by 56%, and the illegal logging was reduced from 80% in 2001 to 20% in 2019. Finally, according to Indonesia's Minister of Environment and Forestry, Indonesia succeeded in reducing deforestation from 460,000 hectares in 2018 to 2019 to 115,000 hectares in 2019 to 2020. This corresponds to a 75% in drop in deforestation rate between these 2 time periods. Vietnam has become a second largest wood processing hub in the world and is now the second largest importer of African timber. It imports around 5 to 6 million cubic meters of timber from more than 100 countries per year. Vietnam Timber Legality Assurance System, VNTALS, once fully operational, will cover both domestic and imported timber sources, as well as domestic and export markets. The LAS is needed to support effective law enforcement in an increasingly complex forestry sector. Its effective implementation is expected to generate forest governance gains in Vietnam, but also in source countries. The VNT LAS is also expected to boost efficiency and to generate reputational benefits for an increasingly significant part of Vietnam's economy. I would like to mention Honduras as another example where the genuine engagement of the private sector and civil society multiple stakeholders platform in charge of developing, implementing, and monitoring verification and certification system has been critical to ensure that resulting legality assurance system remains inclusive, cost-effective, and adaptive. Thanks to the massive participation of all forest sectors and the timber legality assurance system in developing in Honduras has been designed by considering the country's legal framework, stakeholders' capacity, and logistic context, ensuring the system is able to address current and future needs and realities of the sector. This system is also resilient and adaptive as a wide participation over the years has been transcended political affiliations and has allowed the multiple stakeholders platform to collectively put pressure on consecutive administrations after a general election to continue with the previous administration's effort to improve forest governance. In addition to examples from specific countries, I would also like to briefly mention the positive role that certification, such as Forest Stewardship Council or the Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification, can play. These systems focus on promotion of sustainable forest management and responsible chain of custody by operators who decide to participate, generally voluntarily, in a certified supply chain. The SDG indicator 5.21 on the progress towards sustainable forest management measures the area of certified forests and shows these voluntary systems have expanded steadily, boosted by increasingly regulated international market and surge of private and public procurement policies. Synergies or mutual recognition between the voluntary certification and mandatory verification systems contain illegal logging and help reduce deforestation. The examples above show that there are many types of assurance systems that can be adapted to circumstances and needs of all countries. Voluntary and mandatory systems can be combined or can mutually reinforce each other. The lessons learned are useful to many countries trying to respond to growing demand for legally and sustainably produced wood on an increasingly regulated international market. This global market is shaped by a growing number of public and private procurement policies, as well as due diligence regulations such as the Korea's Act on Sustainable Use of Timbers 2017, which we'll hear more about during this Congress. Many of the lessons learned during the development and implementation of verification system in the forest sector could also be applied to other agriculture commodities. The growing commitment in the EU, the UK, and the US to deforestation-free supply chain have prompted the development of new due diligence regulation promoting the trade in deforestation-free commodities. This indicates that policies applied to the wood sector are now being replicated to other commodities. Countries will need to develop new verification or certification system or expand the scope of existing one, but all will need to build on the same principles of robustness, inclusiveness, and national ownership. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize, first, the fight against illegal logging and deforestation is an essential element of global climate change action and is a shared responsibility between timber consumer and producer countries. Second, demand-side due diligence regulation and procurement policies can be an important stimulus for governance reform and development and rollout of verification and certification system in producer countries. Third, Despite minimum transparency and robustness requirements, each producer country will need to find a solution that best fits its own context. Genuine stakeholders' engagement from all sectors is critical to ensure the systems are fit for purpose and inclusive, producing reliable information and claims while allowing widest possible participation among different forest sector operators. There are many lessons from the wood sector to improve governance and to strengthen verification and certification system that could be used for other supply chains driving most of the current deforestation. I thank you for your attention. So may I now invite panelists to join me here at the table. Thank you. Once again, thank you. We have our panelists have been introduced, and as you have heard, we have a wide range from NGO, from business, from government sector. So this is indeed an exclusive engagement in our discussion. So I'm not going to again go back to giving some background. I thought I would have given some details in my statement. So I would like to straight go away to my question. And of course, our Chris will be joining us via video. So let me begin my first question. And I would like to start with Chris, who is very far away from here. So Chris, what is the evidence that a participatory legal and institutional reform and the development of verification or certification systems have contributed to good governance, good forest governance, and to reversing deforestation and forest degradation in your country? Chris,
Well, thank you very much, Senchu, and good morning to all of you. Yeah, so I start straight away by saying that after some 12 years, speaking specifically in the case of Ghana, after some 12 years of it, working to establish the systems prompted by reforms under the voluntary partnership agreement with the EU, it is now clearly evident that forestry administration personnel are now better applying forest management prescriptions. This is because of the robust tracking and verification systems that bring out whatever is done in the remotest part of the country. So that is the first evidence that we're seeing better application of forest management prescriptions. And there is also the availability of better forest transaction data that is prompting revisions in the annual removals of timber stocks from the forest. So again, the systems established make it possible to be informed, and this information is also bringing about the policy actions from the top. And hopefully, as we do this, we align removals of timber stocks with the carrying capacity of the forest. This has implications for forest management. Again, there is evidence that the allocation of timber rights is now better aligned under the reforms with regulatory requirements. So the improvement in governance have led to the elimination of discretionary methods of allocation of timber rights. And therefore, I mean, the governance environment is more sanitized, if you like. And last but not least, is policymaking is clearly multi-stakeholder driven. That is prompting all this. And so the question is, I mean, what are the systems that we put in place to prompt this. And I like briefly to mention, for those who are not very familiar with the term VPA, as I mentioned. So the VPA is part of the EU's action plan to combat illegal logging and trade in illegal timber. And the VPAs are framed as bilateral agreements that a timber producing country enters voluntarily with the EU. And so it is under these systems that we ensure that illegal harvest of timber is restricted in favor of legal timber. So the system and protocols of assessing the legality of timber consignment is done through what we've had in the opening address as legality assurance systems. And there is an introduction of an institutional layer of verification and validation, which is also complemented by an electronic wood tracking system. So I'm mentioning the introduction or re-engineering of institutions. So in our system, the verification and validation functions was not that clearly defined and pronounced, but with the VPA, which I've mentioned as a bilateral agreement between the Ghana and the EU, and with any timber producing country that so desires to enter into it, we established this the timber legality assurance system with this key component of verification and validation, which is complemented by an electronic wood tracking system. So the working principle of the legality assurance system is that wood flow consistencies, as well as non-compliances of actors along the supply chain, are brought into the open, and corrective actions can be systematically applied. So the effect of this new institutional arrangement is that non-compliances to forest management prescriptions become easily detectable with the requisite corrective action and our sanctions where necessary. So that leads us to the evidence that I just mentioned, the four that I just mentioned, better adherence to application of forest management prescriptions, which is a growing outcome of this new legal and institutional framework. So the link of the above gains in the to the fight against illegal deforestation and forest degradation is through really this eliminating illegal logging and bringing harvest down to scientifically defined levels, and the other parts of other elements that I've mentioned as evidence that we are seeing. So thank you for the question, and this is what I put out for this first part. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. May I turn to my friend, Mr. Eric from Indonesia, on the same question. What is the evidence that participatory legal and institutional reform and the development of verification or certification system have contributed to good forest governance and to reversing deforestation and forest degradation in your country?
Okay. Thank you, Janko. I think, as mentioned actually in your keynote speech earlier, we are in Indonesia very fortunate to have established a timber legality system called the SVLK. The SVLK is a mandatory system where all enterprises that utilize any timber product must comply with all of its relevant requirements. This requirement also apply to all stages of production. SVLK became fully implemented in 2016, and since the implementation began, SVLK system has benefited both people and the planet by promoting better forest management. In terms of international timber trade, the SVLK benefits the purchases of Indonesian timber by providing legal assurances that any timber and wood products coming out of Indonesia is coming from legal sources. Benchmark with also international standards. Quoting again what Mr. Norbu mentioned in his opening remarks, in 2021, A CIFOR FAO impact assessment of the SVLK reported that since 2016, the Indonesian deforestation rate dropped by 56%, and that illegal logging was reduced from 80% in 2001 to 20% in 2019. According to our Indonesia's Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Indonesia also succeeded in reducing deforestation from 462,000 hectares in the 2018-2019 period to 115,000 hectares in the 2019 to 2020 period. This corresponds to a 75% drop in deforestation rate between these two time periods. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. May I pose the same question to my friend Jose Martinez from Honduras?
Gracias, Chincho. Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Gracias a FAO y al Servicio Forestal Coreano.
Right, then for FAO and to the Korea Forest Service, I would like to thank you very much for this excellent opportunity to participate in this session. Now, this meeting, this Congress, I believe is highly important for all humankind because we are dealing with issues that are the most pertinent to the planet and to the humankind. Now, for Honduras, a small country, despite that, recently, we also became more renowned in the world because of the recent events. Unfortunately, in January, our former president has now been under the legal prosecution in the US for drug smuggling. And then also in the past few years, there have been a lot of corruption scandals as well as charges. But in the meantime, so in that period, the voluntary partnership agreement was also reached. So we have also had that achievement. Now looking at the Honduras national territory, it's 110,000 square kilometers, and of that, 56% is covered in forest. And the GDP of the country is over $23 trillion, and forestry takes up about 4.4% of the GDP. And 73% of the Honduran population is in poverty. So this means that the country is also faced with huge challenges. Now, for Honduras to reach an agreement with the EU that started in 2013, ending in 2018, meaning that the negotiation process took nearly 6 years. And it was in July last year that this was also ratified by the Congress, meaning that now the agreement is going to go into effect. We also recently had a presidential election, and for the first time in Honduran history, we now have a female president, Xiomara Castro. And currently, in the field of forestry, illegal logging is now the most pressing challenge. So we want to uproot illegal logging from the country. And for us to achieve this goal, so that we will be able to uproot all illegal activities related to timber, it also means that our agreement with the EU is quite important, and it actually has served as a very important catalyst. So for the deforestation and afforestation, in other words, preventing deforestation and afforestation efforts are also an important challenge for the government. So for the government, we are also trying very hard to reduce wildfires and also the illegal logging. So we are trying very hard to eliminate illegal logging. This was also the efforts under the previous government. But in terms of taking actual actions, I would say that there are going to be stronger actions to be taken under the current government. So in the process of such negotiations, then the indigenous communities have also been recognized. Well, they have also demanded to be recognized as important players in the negotiations. And as they took part in the negotiations, and also as the indigenous communities, now in the course of the negotiations, they also have called for recognition of their land ownership. And with such recognition, I believe that it opens up the opportunities for them to become more active in forest protection. And for the Honduras people, we are highly content and happy about the progress made so far. And also, through the agreement with the EU, we will continue to make achievements in our fight against illegal logging.
My second question is about success and lessons. I know we have a lot to share, so my request to the panelists are to be very precise to the point. That is something very useful for our participants here to take home. Let me begin with my friend here, Eric from Indonesia. What are the successes and lessons learned that could be used by others to promote legal and sustainable forest management?
Okay, thank you, Jenko. The SVLK program implemented by the Indonesian government has allowed us to comply with the European Union timber regulation. We see this as a major success that gives our product a competitive advantage over other nations. The SVLK and the EUTR is the first step to combat illegal deforestation. More effort is still required from everybody, from the government and the private sector, to combat illegal deforestation. The key, in my opinion, is further awareness from private stakeholders of the source of their products and the advantages of using FLEGT certified products. This will in turn, of course, boost demands for legally sourced wood. Recently, the Indonesian government has also implemented an e-catalog system whereby government agencies are encouraged and enforced to prioritize the use of locally made products. One of the key requirements to be listed on the e-catalog was to also ensure that they have the SVLK certification. As companies adapt the SVLK, they are forced to become more compliant and in turn be ready to expand their reach from being limited to the local market, also expanding to be able to access the export market as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Now I'm going to Chris. Again, I'm looking for some precision. The questions: what are the successes and lessons learned that could be used by others to promote legal and sustainable forest management? Chris?
Thank you again, Chencho. I answered this in two parts. And the first part is the opening up of the policy-making space, stakeholder involvement in the policy-making process. So some of the big lessons we've learned is the rallying national stakeholders around a shared vision on forest governance. So the tenets of the FLEGT VPA give substance to this and provided an added impetus to the process. The way that stakeholders organize themselves, stakeholders interacted, saw a big push under our reforms in the FLEGT systems implementation. So the shared vision of forest governance also brought about some parity of decision-making power. Like equal voices around the table, and this is key for the reform process. No stakeholder at the decision-making table or in the policy-making platform should seem stronger than the other. Otherwise, it's a skewed process. And the building of trust among stakeholders, again, a big lesson that we have learned. The change in the adversarial approach of civil societies in engaging state actors or government actors is a shift shifts to one of constructive and informed criticism. So it's rather more of critiquing than criticizing. And the opening up of the regulatory space for the participation of civil society, especially in forest legality audits, that has brought some transparency. It has brought some credibility to our compliance reporting. And so more sensitive areas also of policy, such as rights allocation, has seen reforms because of this opening up of the policy space. So it's a very healthy governance environment we are seeing, where views that previously were difficult to tolerate or accommodate from one particular stakeholder to the other are now tolerated, and we have more of a deliberative space instead of mere consultation. And briefly, technically, we noticed that again the big lesson is that forest management or governance is easier when sector or departmental systems talk to each other. So in the process of achieving transparency, in the process of establishing chain of custody, in the process of enabling verifiable, objective verifiable evidence, we realize that removing dividing walls among forest sector implementing agencies to allow seamless exchange of forest transaction data is key. Building an end-to-end, that is from forest to export or sales point, interconnection of databases to establish chain of custody goes a long way to eliminate inconsistencies and improve upon monitoring. And I must say that this systematic accumulation of data, forest transaction data, in the systems moves us from being merely data rich to knowledge rich in decision making. And this is prompting reform that I've mentioned in the earlier responses. So another lesson that I would take off is, sign off with, is making forest management information available publicly supports transparency. So as part of our reform process, it is now a regulatory requirement to make forest management information public, and we do that on our website. Previously, it was a big deal for the public and civil society who use it to access forest management information, but we have made it public now through our website, and this is also pushing the frontiers of forest governance. So these are some technical considerations, including some stakeholder and governance considerations that I put out. Thank you, Chenjo.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Now I come to my friend Jose Martinez. I know Honduras has really rich, lessons to be learned. If you can precisely, given our time limits. Next question, please.
Okay. Desde 2015, quizás la lección más aprendida es...
Right, the lessons that we have learned, I would say, is engagement. In 2015, we formed the technical committee where we had all the stakeholders taking part. It was an open committee, conducive for open negotiations, so anyone who wanted to could participate. They could voice themselves, and we were able to listen to everyone. And it was through this process that we were able to come to an agreement. There were two-part agreements. The first is that we do have a legal system in place, but then the existing legal framework had some contradictions and also a bit confusing, and also had some ambiguity. Now, in my country, there are 298 administrative districts, And in these administrative zones, the taxation method is different. So this was one of the contradictions embedded in the existing legal framework, which actually also led to corruption. The Forestry Act was passed by the Parliament in 2007. Despite this, when illegalities were uncovered, then what were the penalties or the punishments that could be meted out were not clearly stated in the law. For example, when there is illegal logging, then the prosecutor could seize and confiscate the timber, but then there were actually no laws that provided the legal basis for the prosecution's seizure of such illegal timber. So therein lied the contradictions. So what we believe is that within the legality framework and also utilizing the agreement that we have reached, we now have to build a verification system. The more complex a system, then the more liable it is to lead to illegality, corruption, wrongdoing. Because of this, all systems must be strong but simple. And that is what Honduras has to achieve. We are currently running pilot projects to that end. And so through such pilot project, we are going to see what initiatives that we can undertake. So what we have learned is that in order to encourage engagement, that we also need to create a forum where they can all get together and voice themselves. And having such negotiations, now I did mention our negotiations with the EU, which took about 6 years. But it is the kind of process, although challenging, is still necessary so that we will be able to listen from everyone.
Thank you, Jose. Now, let me go to Chris again. For efforts aimed at reversing deforestation and forest degradation to be impactful, there is a need to move towards more mandatory compliance with verification or certification requirements. What is your view on this based on your experience in Ghana? Chris?
Yes, thank you, Shancho. So, yes, I think that the mandatory approach in our experience will yield much better results, or has much better promise, I must say. So it is so because, I say so because the mandatory approach for us means that entire production forest areas and the entire supply chain and all producers are covered, as against the voluntary approach, where portions of the supply chain and selected portions of the forest are covered at the time. So again, this mandatory approach is certainly implemented and enabled because of our approach in establishing the legality assurance system as implemented under the VPA mentioned earlier. So the establishment of this system of mandatory again holds promise because it allows the entire country supply chain to be covered. And the key thing to keep in mind here is a gatekeeping approach at the critical control points, especially the exit to the market, where only material or consignments adjudged to have complied with the totality of laid down regulation can exit the market. So every consignment under a mandatory system that covers the geographical area or a country for that matter, every consignment that is going to the market one can be sure that it is legal, leading to sustainable. However, I mean, to sign up on this, I must say that the establishment of systems of this nature are not entirely done from our experience based on internal will, if you like, alone. It has been enabled by this external stimuli because of the lever of the market that requires this kind of proof of legality to sustainable. So that acts as a kind of pressure to stimulate the reform for us to go mandatory. So yes, I put mandatory approaches. I put a high premium on mandatory approaches as against selective approaches, sometimes experienced under voluntary systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now let me come to Mr. Peter Pilberg from the Preferred by Nature. Can risk-based approaches to verification and certification make systems more effective and support wider compliance?
Thanks for the question, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, Preferred by Nature strongly believe that risk-based approaches should be used to a much larger extent than today, and can be a way of being much more efficient. We have been working with risk-based approaches for more than 15 years now, so it will be strange if I say anything else. If you look into like legality standards and voluntary certification standards, they are all very complex with a lot of requirements. I mean, a typical FSC standard have maybe 300 requirements built in, but in reality, there's relatively few of these requirements where you see a high level of non-compliances that have a high impact on the ground. So if you instead of focusing on evaluating all requirements on an equal basis, focus on those where the issues are, then you can have a much more efficient evaluation process. So my approach would be to get the areas with risk mapped, find way of mitigate that risk, and then focus evaluation around these instead of treating all requirements equally. In Preferred by Nature, we also see risk-based approaches as a core way of addressing certification and evaluation among smallholders. The existing certification system, they have been pretty efficient in getting impact for the big guys, those that have the money and the capacity to pay for certification. While on a global scale, in big picture, they have had major challenges when it comes to the small guys. And also the risks are typically different when you are talking about large operations compared to small operations. Typically, if it's like a small family holding with maybe 1 hectare, I mean, you have no workers, you don't expect huge management plans, training, manuals, procedures, etc. It's a relatively simple operation, and there's maybe only a few risks that can be addressed through a due diligence process instead of a traditional certification. So focus on where the issues are and address these. Both the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, and PEFC has established what they called, FSC called it controlled wood, and the PEFC controlled sources for where they are using a risk-based approach. The FSC controlled wood program, I would say that's the most comprehensive program that exists. It has, I have personally been involved in developing it for the last 20 years. And to be frank, the first version of it was a disaster. but I also think that now the system is close to something that actually is both efficient and have impact on the ground, which at the end of the day is what's important. The system has been developed targeted non-certified material to ensure that it doesn't come from unacceptable sources when it's mixed with certified material and ending up in a product carrying a certification claim and sold as certified. And when we're talking about both schemes, it is not the forest itself that's the unit of certification. It's typically those who are receiving the wood from the forest. It can be a roundwood trader, it can be a mill, and they are then implementing a due diligence system to ensure that the wood is not coming from unacceptable sources. When I say that risk-based approaches see it has much bigger potential, it's also important to stress that it's under certain conditions, and I will try to mention a few of them here. First, the organization implementing the due diligence process, implementing the control measures need to be close to the forest. If you are far away from the forest or the source, you have no power to actually ensure that specific requirements are enforced or in place by the forest operations. Secondly, I would say that the risks need to be clearly defined and need to be specific. And they need to be defined by somebody independent of the operation implementing the due diligence system to ensure that all organizations sourcing from the same area are mitigating the right risk in the right way. They need to be specific. The more specific they can be, the easier it is to mitigate them. If you can say it's an area has a high-risk area, it doesn't help you much, but if you can say within this area there's a specific problem related to some specific issues, then it is possible to implement control measures to address the specific risks. Another point I would like to stress, don't rely on paper only. We have seen many companies implementing due diligence system where they are just collecting piles of papers and think now everything is in place. In some parts of the world, actually quite many, you can get any paper with any signature. It's just a matter of paying a bit of money. What happens on the ground, that's what's important, not what paper says. Of course, required papers shall be in place. And the last point I would like to mention is that there, of course, also need to be a robust verification system in place to ensure that the system is actually functioning and have the impact on the ground in order to mitigate the identified risks. Thank you.
Thank you. For the first round of panel, the last question I have is for Eric. For the verification and certification systems to have a real impact, wider compliance is needed, but smaller producers and businesses are often challenged by system requirements. What has Indonesia done to overcome this challenge?
Okay, thank you, Shenko. I think this is also related to what Peter was mentioning before, a risk-based approach. So learning on present experiences, there are various ways in which the government has been adapting regulation in order to make the system more efficient and impactful. One of the biggest challenges faced by the industry is how the system is able to define and differentiate small to large scale, high risk and low risk producers, and how the regulation would affect them. Referring to the outcome of the second VPA impact assessment, it is analyzed that out of 226 small-medium enterprises in a city called Jepara and Pasuruan in Indonesia, there are only 13 companies that are SVLK certified, and these are all made up of small to medium enterprises. Now, through collaboration with FAO and also other government and private institutions, various assistance and subsidies have been granted to allow small-scale producers to obtain SVLK certification and also to become compliant. This allows a level playing field for small operators to still be able to access the market with their products. The government has also recently adapted their classification systems with regards to audit frequency, validity periods, and subsidy grants to assist small operators to achieve the required certifications. These efforts by the government and also the private sectors is made in an effort to overcome the barriers of uptake of the SVLK certification and to allow them to enjoy further benefits of the program itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Without further ado, may I invite Melissa to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as we've been hearing, VPAs are really incomparable in creating participatory forest governance reforms and as a complement to the EUTR. So this presentation, short presentation, considers both EUTR and other timber legality frameworks in tackling the trade in illegal timber. So this is based on a paper that's available on the World Forestry Congress website. So if you'd like further details, you can look there. The objective was to really identify key elements for revising existing and developing new timber legality frameworks, as well as looking at elements that could be applicable for new laws on forest risk commodities. Okay, so the timber legality frameworks that I looked at were these 5, and they were selected because they make up a sizable share of the global wood products import market, and the laws were either passed or amended in 2017, allowing for analysis of implementation and, in some cases, enforcement. There have been a number of countries that have since developed similar laws, and those are interesting, as well as the laws related to forest risk commodities, which are being developed. Next slide. So the paper looked at a number of different elements, including definitions of illegal timber, enforcement actions, penalties, products, and others. But I wanted to really focus on due diligence as well as declarations, because as we've already been discussing in terms of the involvement of the private sector in really looking at and having the information related to their supply chains, assessing the risk, and then mitigating the risk in the importing before the products are imported. So that's, even though these frameworks look very different, the strongest ones have those 3 key elements of collecting information, assessing risk, and mitigating. One important element is also, in some frameworks, they have a declaration, which can require information about country of harvest, specific species, things like that, which can only help to create stronger due diligence systems. Next slide. So a few key lessons are that these demand-side laws really represent an emerging consensus in trying to reduce illegal logging and associated deforestation worldwide. And although the approaches are different, they really seek to shift trade away from illegal timber and towards legal. Some other important provisions are the ability of the government to seize the illegal goods, because that really helps to incentivize legal sourcing. And then we've seen that mandatory frameworks can really make a significant contribution towards reducing illegal trade, as I saw in analyses of both US and EU imports. And next slide. The key lessons related to due diligence are on the next slide, which, yes, perfect, thank you. Which I already mentioned in the table are these strong frameworks require information and assessment and mitigation. And they can create this really strong iterative process between suppliers, companies, enforcement officials, if there are really strong requirements and penalties. And that really pushes change in sourcing practices more quickly. And explicit procedures in these laws for due diligence can make it easier for governments to enforce and prosecute, as we've seen in a number, actually many EU competent authority enforcement actions. And as I mentioned, declarations can help create those due diligence systems more quickly. And then to the last slide, thinking about some of these elements can actually be incorporated into future frameworks to address the trade in forest risk commodities, because we're seeing that there are these commitments to end deforestation, such as the Glasgow Declaration, and land clearing for agriculture is the largest driver of deforestation. So there are new laws under development in the EU, UK, and US, and they have different approaches, but they all seek to try to address that, the deforestation caused by land conversion. And due diligence is central to these proposed frameworks. So thank you very much, and back to the panel.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Since we are running out of time, I am now directly going to the second question. May I ask Peter, can experiences from forest sector certification be used for other commodities and vice versa? What are the possible synergies between regulatory and voluntary systems? Peter, if you could concisely.
Okay, I will try to be short. So I mean, clearly there's a lot of experience exchange between the different sectors. The forest sustainable certification schemes have been around for about 30 years now. And clearly many of the agricultural schemes that have been developed later have been heavily inspired by some of the experience and lessons learned, and also mistakes from the forest sector schemes. Some widely applied approaches today, such as high conservation value, HCV, such as cutoff dates for conversion and so on, is coming from the forest certification schemes and are now broadly applied within agricultural scheme. I would say the entire process is also facilitated by the ICIL Alliance, the global umbrella organization, which most of the voluntary certification schemes is a part of. In Preferred by Nature, we are working with multiple different schemes in more than 100 countries, and we can see a huge overlap between the requirements in the different schemes. I will also say there's also other way where there's options that the forest schemes can learn from the agricultural schemes. It has taken place, but there's also some areas that's obvious where there need to be improvement within the forest certification scheme. One critical thing I see is the volume control system in the forest certification schemes. Both the PEFC and the FSC is operating on a control system that's very much paper-based and very open to fraud, and it is happening to, I would say, significant scale. What's happening is very simple, that you are including information on to your customer that this wood is certified, but the information on the invoice presented to the auditors like us does not include this information. The agricultural scheme some scheme has a very robust volume control system that also should be implemented within the forest certification schemes. Another area, the last I will mention, it seems like we are running out of time, is the use of GIS and satellite data. Neither of the two forest certification schemes today require that shapefiles from the certified operations. I see a huge potential for being much more efficient in evaluation of compliance if you could use satellite data and use artificial intelligence. But of course, you need to know where the forest is located in order to be able to do that. And it's also, I see it also important for stakeholder engagement, in order for stakeholders to provide feedback to the certification processes. They obviously need to know where the certified operations is located, and if they don't do that, basically it's very hard to provide feedback. I think I will stop here. So
Thank you very much. So this is my last question to my friend here, Jose. Within 2 to 3 minutes, if you can share with us, what are the messages producer countries could send to consumer countries to ensure that their procurement policies, due diligence regulations do not unduly penalize producer countries? Jose.
Como dije anteriormente, somos un país
Well, as I have mentioned earlier, for a country like Honduras, the poor population share is quite high, and then also for the smallholders. Now, for them, the profit that they generate out of production does not entirely belong to them. And that is why oftentimes they would resort to illegal logging or illegal cultivation. And then for us to address these issues and to overturn the situation, then let's say, for example, if there is a big wildfire, sometimes it can just start with a very small spark. So domestically speaking, all the participants So for us to have all the participants in the VPA, that actually took about 5 years. So then the message that I want to say to you is that what is currently being discussed in the Brussels, so some of the potential solutions that are under discussion. Now, what I believe is important is that we need to make sure that through these discussions and solutions, we have to make sure that more benefits will be provided to the smallholders so that we will be able to make improvement in the poverty, so that they will not be tempted to resort to illegal activities, meaning that we have to improve their reality in order to improve forest governance. And that is where we need cooperation from the developed markets as well.
Thank you very much. Before I invite our next speaker, I want to thank my friend, colleague, panelists who have been cooperating, understanding with the time that we have here. Thank you so much for your inputs. With this, may I invite Ms. Shyam Satakuru for their final remarks, closing. Thank you.
I'm so sorry, that was a bit of a technical glitch with my mask and the, and the microphone. May I begin by thanking Mr. Moderator, our distinguished panelists for all your wonderful inputs and discussions today, and also to the session organizers for giving me the privilege of being here to do the closing remarks for this very important session. From what I have heard from the presentations this morning, also from Ms. Melissa towards the end, and the inputs from all the panelists, I think the key messages here would be as follows. It is now clear that there are varying market requirements and a multitude of due diligence regulations and public and private procurement policies in the marketplace. Coinciding with a growing demand for legally and sustainably produced wood, legal and institutional frameworks related to forest governance have seen notable improvement in many countries, including via international engagement aimed at providing confidence and assurance to the markets and continued market access and consumption, i.e., risk mitigation measures. The second point is the genuine engagement of private sector and civil society in multi-stakeholder platforms who are involved in the process of developing, implementing, and monitoring verification and certification systems is critical to ensure that systems are inclusive, in other words, adaptable to the country's legal framework, stakeholders' capacity, and to the logistical context, allowing the participation of smallholders, communities, and medium and small, medium-sized enterprises. They need to be cost-effective, resilient, adaptive, and most importantly, enforceable. The third point I wish to make here is would legality verification and certification systems that have developed over the years in response to the due diligence requirements and procurement policies contribute to improved forest management on the ground and contributes towards halting deforestation and forest degradation? Verification systems, whether voluntary or mandatory, must be credible and robust to demonstrate that a commodity has been legally and sustainably produced. This ties in with the first bullet point. Simultaneously, they should not constitute market barriers, which hinder or disincentivize the global trade in legal and sustainably produced wood products. Lessons learned from the design, development, and the implementation of selected systems, be it voluntary or mandatory systems, or be it the TLASs that were developed under the various VPA negotiations and similar tools, is critical to ensure that countries develop and implement verification systems that are appropriate to their context. Lessons learned from verification and certification systems developed in the forest sector can also bring significant lessons learned for other land use sectors. I hope these closing remarks have captured succinctly what was discussed at this session. And again, I thank you very much for your participation, mainly to the audience, and also thank you for a great session. Pleasure is mine. Thank you.